I really appreciate being allowed to come and play with you guys here. They let me out of my cage in Watershed Sciences. And I've really enjoyed the talks, particularly this afternoon, and particularly this last talk, getting very creative on ways of forcing ourselves to take some risks. On some of this stuff, we need to take some bigger risks if we hope to tackle the scope of the problems. For some of you that have heard me talk, I had a couple of people comment, surprised to see you talking about something other than beaver. Don't worry, I've snuck them in. But what I wanted to do is really pick up on this theme that the whole conference is organized around, and that's managing water by managing land. And we can't look at these watersheds without looking at the whole systems, but we've heard a number of wonderful talks and examples about managing uplands, particularly to better take care of our water resources. And I want to flip that around. We need to both manage those uplands, but also what can we do to manage our riverscapes better for water resources. And it goes without saying, in the American West, water is everything. It's definitely worth fighting and dying over. And so I'm going to just kind of unpack my title here with a random sort of western landscape here, a hillshade shown in the background. And first thing, just to point out, well, what are riverscapes? This is just really a shorthand for, well, am I talking about big rivers or small streams? And is it the river and its floodplain or the valley bottom, et cetera, et cetera? All of that, okay? So if we look here at a riverscape with the drainage network here, just perennial streams shown on top of this landscape. The riverscape is not just those blue lines, it's not just the streams, it's not just the channels, it's also the valley bottoms that they flow through and that they've formed, okay? And so when I'm talking about riverscapes here, I'm really talking about managing these whole corridors. And you could think of them, and indeed those valley bottoms, as they're the part of the landscape that could plausibly flood under the contemporary flow regime. And by plausibly flood with whatever our flow regime is now or could be with climate change, we mean either in its, in a degraded condition or it closer to achieving its full potential. And so when we look at these riverscapes, as I've mentioned, they're made up of these green and blue areas. They're made up of the areas that actively flood, and then the channel or indeed channels that carve up that landscape and build that landscape up. They are adjacent to upslope areas, and we've heard a lot, especially about forest upland restoration treatments and conservation efforts, a lot of it aimed at fuels reduction and at mitigating impacts of large fires. So these riverscapes abut those, and particularly where the channels get right up against those, that's where these channels can feed themselves meals from those uplands. That's one of our connectivity or our linkage points. And so those meals can be sediment, they can be wood, other organic matter, but they can also run up against former floodplains or terraces that maybe the whole system has cut down and left behind, or the little piles of sediment that puke out of tributaries, right? Fans that come in and feed these systems, okay? And so if you can read a riverscape, so here's a little riverscape right here, and if these are two cross sections, and if I go back, one here, where I've got this terrace, and then there's a channel over here and some beaver dams, and one here, reading a riverscape is really critical for identifying what opportunities exist from a conservation and a restoration perspective, as well as looking at what risks may be there when we consider, for example, land use or infrastructure that abuts those areas or that may exist within them. And so back to this title of Managing Riverscapes for Resilience of Water Resources, We've heard the term resilience used a lot. It's one of these, it's like sustainability, who could argue with this, right? So we could think of our dictionary definition of resilience, the capacity to recover quickly from difficultness, toughness. If you're a person, this is maybe, grittiness, no matter what life throws at you, you can come back. And what I just want to make us think a little more carefully about is we can't talk about resilience in any context without being very clear about resilience of what and to what. And so here I'm talking about resilience of our water resources and the things and people that depend on that, farms, ranches, working lands, and indeed aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems and the riparian ecosystems that span the two, but resilience from, and you guys could fill this in. I mean, we've heard this, we've heard a lot of these talks today already talking about these disturbance events. Certainly in a riverscape, floods is obvious, and we saw examples of exacerbated floods post-fire, some really impressive debris flows. Drought, right, the exact opposite of this. Wildfires, and then invasions, for example, of exotics. And so if we then kind of think a little bit more about these landscapes that we all care about and are interested in trying to better manage, there are plenty of other threats in addition to those disturbances that we talked about. One of the other sort of backdrops to this is, this is an example from the Bear River watershed. And this is the Bear River starting up in the Uintas, flowing down through Bear Lake, up and into Cache Valley and then out. And this is basically just a projection of peak snow water equivalent from our snowpack of how much water we're going to lose. And so we can avoid a bunch of these details, but these are just warming scenarios, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degrees. And something like 22% with a 1 degree warming scenario, and I think we saw an earlier talk point out that we're here already. 22% of that volume of water that's normally locked up in snowpack at peak snow conditions and slowly leaked out it will be lost, and up to a 4 degrees, we can range up to 63% of that. So, something on the order of 2.9 billion cubic meters of water just in the Bear River watershed. So this is, if these are big numbers, this is, more doom and gloom and scary in terms of some of the disturbances that we're likely to face with climate change. Now, resilience is not always a desirable thing. So if you have resilience, or persistence of degraded or poor conditions, here's a deceptively decent looking little stream, right? It's got shade, it's got, water. It's garbage habitat from an aquatic perspective. It's a bowling alley. It lacks any sort of real structure, and there's just this single age stand of alder that have come in and locked in place banks, which are nothing more than levees that are the spoils from a bulldozer straightening this channel. So this looks deceptively good, and we see a lot of a lot of riverscapes that ironically are very, very resilient, but they're resilient stuck in these degraded conditions. So we like resilience of these things when the scapes, whether it's landscapes or riverscapes, are realizing the potential. They're in good condition, and we can throw different disturbances at them, or they can experience different disturbances, and they maintain that good condition, and they keep providing some of the things that we're interested in, for example, water resources. So are resilient systems in poor condition harder to restore? Well, sometimes yes, but it turns out some of these are actually easier to restore if we know what we're doing. And another thing to kind of think about before we move on from the sort of resilience caveats is that adaptation to change, instead of persisting in the face of change, is another alternative to consider in some systems. It's how we just accept that that system is going to change and then adapt to that. Or how do we change via restoration from a poor condition resilient system to a good condition resilient system. So translating this to something simple, we have lots and lots of riverscapes in the West. For example, probably at least, depending on how you want to run the numbers, over 200,000 miles of the 320,000 miles of perennial watercourses in the Intermountain West are degraded. And if we pull back from that little view and look at this is supposedly, this is a creek, this is a river. Where's the riverscape? Not just a rhetorical question. Is the riverscape, and if I look at this for restoration potential, it's kind of, from here to here. Maybe I'd look at vegetation indicators, and I see this sagebrush up here, right? Well, sagebrush, that's an upland species, right? So, clearly the riverscape is just here. It's just here. But actually, if we read this a little more carefully, this is a riverscape. The system, the channel has cut down, it's incised, and it's left this much broader riverscape, basically pretending to be an upland. This is a very common situation where we really undersell the potential of what's possible because the baselines have shifted for so long and by such dramatic extents that we have a hard time recognizing what these things could be. Technical term for these sorts of systems, these are structurally starved bowling alleys. I'm sort of joking, but not on the structurally starved part. The structure I'm talking about is wood and beaver dams. It could be, in some systems, boulders, etc. But they're basically obstructions to flow that create more diversified hydraulics. And so I think that our eye for what is possible in these riverscapes and these valley bottoms, we don't have as many analogs out there of what these places could be. Here's a few examples in very different energy flow environments of what many more riverscapes much more commonly looked like. And for those of you that haven't picked up Ben Goldfarb's book on beaver, I encourage you to have a read. He does a great job of just talking about how dramatically different the waterways of North America used to look prior to our handiwork in terms of trapping them out of so many systems and lowering their numbers. So what I want you to think about are some of the guiding principles that help us understand, for many riverscapes, what constitutes a healthy system. The first is streams need space, and how much depends on the system. But their space is basically, they need space to adjust within their valley bottom. These things are called floodplains for a reason. They're supposed to flood, okay? And so another really, really important concept that comes back to the title is that structure, so in this case, a few little beaver dams here are what are forcing complexity in everything, basically changing the timing of delivery of all mass, water, sediment, nutrient, wood, through this system. They're diversifying that residence time. That makes more complex habitat, and it builds resilience of this system to disturbance. How important those two things are depends. It depends on the sorts of things you'd ask a fluvial geomorphologist about, but basically the flow regime and the environmental setting. And then this one is really fundamental too. And it's the exact opposite of how we've managed most of our waterways, both in North America and Europe, Asia, and beyond. And that is that the inefficient conveyance of water is often a good indicator of health. So the shared vision is for resiliency. And one of the ways, this is a slide I stole from Jeremy Maestas, one of the ways that Jeremy talks about building some of this resiliency is by re-wetting the sponge, taking areas that are very efficient drains right now, but aren't holding on to that, that water and slowly leaking it out, for example, over a long dry summer in an arid environment. And so he refers to this as sort of building up that natural store, your piggy bank of water, so that through the long growing season, we have increased soil moisture that can feed better productivity and ultimately higher resiliency of this system. But how do we do that? So one of the things that we have to get over is this notion that efficiency is always good. And so that's that last principle. And so really the way so this is a system that is very efficient. It doesn't have much in the way of roughness elements, right? It conveys water. And if you have a problem, a flooding problem, this has been the conventional wisdom, right? What do you do when you have a flooding problem? You actually told me in the break. It was you get that thing off your property as quick as possible and downstream so it's someone else's problem. That has been an absolute, repeated failure over and over and over again. And instead, flood control managers are turning to this magical thing, attenuation or inefficiency. Basically letting systems flood where we can allow them to. And this is an example from up the canyon in Temple Fork where beaver have made an absolute mess and cluttered this system and leveled all these cottonwoods, and they are holding on to that water much longer. The system is more resilient, and it's rivaling some of the functions that we're losing in diminishing snowpacks. So if I have a stream that comes through and this little thin blue line is the original stream with no obstructions to flow, it is a well-behaved, efficient drain. It also lacks many of the characteristics that we would hope to see in what would otherwise be wet meadows. This is an example with beaver coming in and clogging this system up. And what that does is basically if you measure the flow coming into the top of that reach here in blue and the flow exiting at the bottom, it basically knocks the peaks off the flood, and then that excess water goes to a couple of places. One is to elevating base flows on the recession limbs of those flood hydrographs. This is time and this is flow. And then some of it also goes into increased productivity of vegetation within that valley bottom. That question I asked of how do we do this, just a shameless plug. We've been working on defining a standard of practice, and there's a manual on what we call low-tech process-based restoration. I'll get into that in a second, of these riverscapes, or a dumbed down, just pretty pictures and kind of cut to the chase pocket guide version of that. Those are free online, or you can get hard copies. And then coupled with this year's conference, we are teaching a 2.5-day workshop starting tomorrow afternoon on this stuff. So we've got folks coming in from all over the country and a bunch of locals taking that. And so as we transition into what and how we do that, some of the principles that we have here are antithetical to standard restoration practice in how we deal with stream restoration, river restoration. It's okay to make a mess. There's strength in numbers. In standard restoration practice, we tend to like to build really big, fancy statues, monuments to our engineering prowess. And we build a lot of sloppy structures that aren't designed to last. They're designed to kickstart processes. And so we use natural building materials, and the processes that we're kickstarting, we're letting the system do the work. We're also deferring some of the decision making so that we can get to hopefully self-sustaining states of resilience. And this structural forcing, building resilience, I just want to show you a couple of examples of what that looks like. Basically, I've already sort of said this, but if you put some obstruction to flow in, it changes the hydraulics, i.e. the speed and the depth of water. That changes how much erosion and deposition, the shaping of geomorphic processes take place in that system, and builds more diverse habitat, okay? The key processes that we tend to focus on, these are by no means the only, are wood accumulation and beaver dam activity. These are, in one case a rodent, and in the other case a bunch of wood drifting down and piling up in jams. These are things that force those processes, and we get resilience out of. Now, this concept has been adapted by groups that you might associate more with doing lots of upland restoration. But here's one manifestation of that. This is a plot of years since restoration and resiliency. And what's shown in the dots here are an example of one. This isn't low-tech restoration as much as it is just common sense management, changing grazing to basically allow some riparian recovery, not using the grazing, just changing the intensity and the timing of this, and getting riparian recovery that then allowed beaver to come in. And then what's happening here is really cool. This is resiliency, and the way we're measuring this is we're taking basically greenness, NDVI, and so productivity of these valley bottoms, how much vegetation they're producing, and looking at how sensitive they are to precipitation. And so if you get a low number, if you have a drought year, then basically the system tracks the drought. Everything dries up. You have a big year, everything greens up. What this is showing is it doesn't matter if you have droughts or floods, we start to see resilience of the resource here, in this case productivity of the valley bottom, over time. We're seeing similar results from simple structures in intermittent and ephemeral draws that try and slow water down and create little opportunities to grow green groceries, and then similar results where we build fake beaver dams and let beaver take over and do the work. This is now become a nationally adopted conservation practice. So on private lands, you can actually apply and get money and reimbursed through the Farm Bill to do this sort of work. Another example of resilience is resilience to fire. And this is a really cool thing. It's this really complicated phenomena of when you have a fire, when it hits water, for some reason it doesn't burn, right? And so these valley bottoms here have beaver dams in them, which have wetted up these sponges, and then these become really important refugia for wildlife and or livestock during fires. And they also accelerate the recovery post-fire. So back to that water resources question, how big could the sponge be? We've done some work to look at, how much storage you get both in the ponds and in groundwater. And basically, here are some numbers in terms of acre feet and surface water, groundwater increases with different densities of structure or beaver dams on the landscape. And the bottom line is that in terms of that doom and gloom of snow water equivalent that I showed you before, within those valley bottom areas, it can mitigate, a respectable number, 5 to 12% of that volume. But the caveat is that this is a volume of water that doesn't just melt off. This is a volume of water that gets replenished and keeps cycling throughout the season, because we have perennial flows in these systems. So we have this principle of letting the system do the work. Where possible, the gains are quicker and there's more instant gratification with beaver doing the work. And I'm just going to sort of rush through a little example here. There's that valley bottom. There's my riverscape. Here's a thin little thread of a stream that is, about this wide. And then here are fake beaver dams. These are the same things that the class the next couple of days will build. And then beaver were dumped in, and beaver expand those and create these backwatered areas as well as these overflow areas, and dramatically change this thing. And so in this little system up the road, 28 structures were built, 10 beaver were dumped in, and they've built another 150 dams in the past few years. And so when we look at restoration and conservation strategies, especially the restoration, we may initially mimic process, but we want to quickly get to promoting the system exercising those processes, and then eventually it's sustaining it on its own. And so that's our ultimate goal. This is a cartoon from an article in Science that talked about this. So in closing, managing riverscapes to be less efficient drains and more effective sponges helps us increase our resilience of our water resources. And this low-tech process-based restoration is one of the ways in which in some of these systems that are resilient in degraded states, that we can bump them up into a better system. So with that, I'll shut up.
We have time for a few questions for Joe.
That's out in Idaho. This is just outside of Haley, or over the hill from Haley. And this was a system that we were looking at with Idaho Fish and Game, where they wanted to encourage beaver to expand further in that system by putting some BDAs in. And we looked at it, and then about a month later, 50,000 acres burnt. And these beaver were actually, the guy, Terry, that we were working with at Idaho Fish and Game, he had reintroduced those over the last 20 years in that system. And they're the only places that look half decent. Everywhere else, the whole thing just burnt to the ground. And so we did an emergency restoration project in the areas that there weren't beaver to try and take the excess energy we were hoping to get from post-fire runoff and do some of the work quickly. Unfortunately, we had a really perfect snowpack last spring, and then the weather just eked that out ever so gently. And so it worked really, really well, but it wasn't a great test. I wanted a real big, in-your-face flood, but we didn't get it. So, yeah.
Joe, when you see embers landing in a lot of those beaver dams and burning them up in what places do you expect?
I saw my first burnt beaver dam right here. I'd never actually seen a beaver dam burnt. Again, this thing, water apparently doesn't burn. And all it was is the mattress out in front. That's just like a nice little pile of kindling. And the rest of the dam that still had some saturation was totally intact. So what we do see, this is not an area where the valley bottom's wide enough to act as a fire break. So it might be refugia during the fire, but the valley bottom is short enough that it could just hop right over that. There's other places where it's a little wider, and it actually does act as a break to its advance. Yeah?
I hear a lot of ranchers and land managers kind of changing their attitudes around beaver, especially in kind of the past 10 years.
Yes.
What do you think has contributed to that, and how do you think we can kind of measure those social processes that might be part of this larger process, this restoration?
I think the main things that have contributed to that are having a conversation with those ranchers that is not about, reintroducing beaver on their land for beaver's sake. It's a conversation about, their operations, how they are using their valley bottoms, how important water is to them, and then trying to see if there are places where beaver can help play a role. I mean, the real thing is results, so for this example I showed from up the road, Jay Wild's motivation was basically to take a stream that used to always flow perennially, and over the past 25 years, and in the absence of beaver and with increasing, ET off of forests that haven't burned, it's gone intermittent. It dries up. And so he just didn't think that was right. He wanted to see if there was something that could be done, and that's starting to work.